It started with a letter. Not the kind written out of kindness, the kind that arrives with a header, a logo, and the faint smell of superiority. The envelope came from the Cedarwood Heights HOA, the neighborhood's self-declared gatekeepers of beauty. And inside that envelope, neatly typed and signed in cursive that screamed arrogance, was their latest concern. My house, according to them, was visibly inconsistent with community aesthetics. Translation: it wasn't beige enough. The note was written like a legal document but read like an insult. While we appreciate your enthusiasm for individuality, it said, your chosen exterior color detracts from the neighborhood's coordinated appearance. That enthusiasm they were talking about? My house. A soft slate blue with white trim and cedar shutters. A calm, classic color that made me proud every time I pulled into the driveway. It wasn't gaudy, it wasn't bright, and by any reasonable standard, it was beautiful. But apparently it wasn't Cedarwood-approved beige. And everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who filed the complaint. My neighbor 2 doors down. Cynthia. She was the sort of person who looked at suburban living not as a shared space but as a personal empire. Her yard was immaculate, sterile even. Sculpted shrubs trimmed at perfect angles like green geometry. Her mailbox painted to match the color of her shutters. She was the kind of person who ironed her welcome mat. For a while, I laughed it off. Figured it was another HOA power move that would fade away if I ignored it long enough. But 2 weeks later, the fines arrived, $100 for noncompliance, and a threat that they'd escalate if I didn't restore my property to community standards. That's when it clicked. This wasn't going to stop. Cynthia had power now. She wasn't just a noisy neighbor. She was on the HOA board. And this wasn't just about color. It was control. For the next week, she made sure to parade past my driveway every morning, pausing long enough to shoot subtle glances at the house like she was inspecting damage no one else saw. And then came the second letter. Failure to comply may result in further action, including potential legal recourse. I remember standing there, in front of the mailbox, and laughing. A hollow, exhausted kind of laugh. Because I realized something funny. They didn't want compliance. They wanted obedience. And that's when I decided they weren't going to get it. If my house color offended them that much, if it really hurt the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood, I was going to make sure it left an impression they'd never forget. Most people shrink when the HOA pushes. I got creative. The next morning, I started sketching. I opened design apps, mixed digital palettes, and laughed harder with each combination. Bright ones, loud ones, defiant ones. I studied every shade of every color they banned. Magentas, violets, pastels, and neons. By the end of that week, my idea was complete. Not vandalism, not destruction. Just the perfect, poetic act of suburban defiance. I filed my permit request through the HOA's website, same as always. I attached vague blueprints and called it a color correction project. The description was intentionally dull, technical enough to get approved without raising any suspicion. The board, complacent after years of chasing mailbox paint violations, rubber-stamped it without reading twice. That's what happens when people are blinded by bureaucracy. By the time Cynthia realized what I was doing, the primer was already up. A thin white canvas stretching across the old slate blue, ready for what came next. And oh, what came next? Neighbors watched curiously as contractors unloaded paint buckets not labeled taupe or sandstone, like every house around here, but pure, unapologetic color. I could almost hear Cynthia's composure cracking from 2 doors down. Still, I stayed silent. I didn't post progress updates, didn't warn anyone. I wanted it to hit them all at once. The HOA, the neighbors, the queen of beige herself. By the following weekend, the final coat would be dry. And let's just say it wouldn't be beige. It would be a masterpiece. A carefully planned, technically legal, gloriously defiant kind of masterpiece. One that would soon turn Cedarwood Heights into a viral sensation. Because I wasn't just painting a house anymore. I was painting a point. Daybreak came quietly, but the air buzzed with something electric. Even the birds seemed to pause as the final brushstrokes went up. My house, once the HOA's public enemy number 1, now stood like a challenge painted in color. Bold, mocking, unapologetic. The contractors had just finished packing up, their laughter still echoing down the street. They didn't understand the story behind the job. To them, it was just another house, another paycheck. But for me, each color, each line meant something deeper. It was revenge wrapped in art, defiance disguised as design, perfectly balanced between legal and legendary. The front face gleamed in deep cobalt blue, the kind that shifted under sunlight, sometimes navy, sometimes indigo. Surrounding it, the trim shimmered in crisp white. But what truly made it pop was the detail no one saw coming. A mural that stretched from the garage door to the side wall, painted in geometric gradients of lavender, honey gold, and warm coral. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Every line flowed together, forming a subtle wave, a visual echo of calm, warmth, and irony. Because what was Cynthia's reason for filing that first complaint? My house was too depressing, lacked vibrancy, didn't complement the neighborhood's palette of harmony. Well, now it complemented nothing, and yet somehow it fit perfectly. By midday, the whole street had noticed. Cars slowed down as drivers craned their necks. Some neighbors looked shocked. Others smiled like they just witnessed the first breeze after a drought. But there was one person I'd been waiting for. Right around 2 o'clock, the door to house number 118 creaked open. Out stepped Cynthia. She froze halfway down her walkway, dressed in her usual sun hat and gardening gloves, clutching her pruning shears like they were armor. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. For a brief, beautiful moment, she was speechless. A phenomenon this neighborhood had only theorized about before now. Across her face, I could see disbelief melting into fury, then horror, then something like realization. The mural was too smooth, too polished. It wasn't graffiti or chaos. It was art. And worse, it was completely legal. You could almost see her calculating in real time, flipping through imaginary bylaws she could no longer weaponize. There was nothing she could do. My colors fit every zoning regulation, every building code. I had paint permits signed, filed, and notarized. If the first letter they'd sent was an attack, then this was my counterstrike. As afternoon turned to evening, the news spread beyond Cedarwood Heights. Someone walking their dog took a photo. That photo hit the community Facebook page before sunset. And that's when things went viral. Within hours, comments flooded in from outsiders who loved it. Finally, a house with personality, one said. Looks like a postcard come to life, said another. Someone jokingly added, when your HOA bans creativity, but you pass the vibe check anyway. By the next morning, the post had reached a local news outlet, then a regional one. Homeowner turns HOA complaint into a public art statement. That headline was the spark. The story caught fire. Soon, reporters were emailing. News vans rolled slowly down our street, cameras zooming in from the curb while neighbors pretended not to care but peeked through blinds anyway. A few neighbors grew nervous. Attention made them uneasy, but not as uneasy as it made Cynthia. For once, her rules didn't matter. The story had outgrown her spreadsheets. The HOA called an emergency meeting that weekend. It was supposed to be about property uniformity, but instead, it turned into a sparring ring of frustration. Some homeowners defended the mural loudly. Others, mostly Cynthia's loyal few, demanded fines, sanctions, anything. But the one thing no one could deny was how much attention the neighborhood was getting, attention of the best kind. Realtors, architecture bloggers, even local tourists started calling. The so-called ugly house was now a destination. Suddenly, property values weren't dropping. They were climbing. Cynthia's argument crumbled under the weight of irony. The very thing she'd hated, individuality, had become the reason people admired Cedarwood Heights again. That week, when I came home from work, I found something new at the edge of my yard. A small, handwritten note in elegant handwriting. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from another neighbor down the street. Thank you for the color. We needed it. I didn't need recognition. But in that moment, it felt like vindication. By the time night fell, the mural glowed faintly under my porch lights. The blues, purples, and ambers looked alive, like fire caught in slow motion. Cynthia's house, once the shining emblem of HOA-approved perfection, now looked dull beside it. Her complaints had painted my house brighter than I ever could have alone. And as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I couldn't help but smile. Because the thing about control freaks is they don't know what to do when they lose control. And tomorrow, when reporters returned for interviews, Cynthia's next mistake would make sure that loss became permanent. The Monday after the story hit the news, Cedarwood Heights felt strange. The air buzzed with excitement, embarrassment, and something like disbelief. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years suddenly stopped in the street to talk about color theory. Strangers drove by slowly, snapping photos from car windows. My quiet blue house had become a landmark, a symbol, and a spectacle all at once. I didn't plan for fame, but fame, especially in a small, gossip-fueled HOA, arrives whether you're ready or not. By midweek, the story had spread beyond the local paper. A national morning show picked it up for a short feel-good segment. A popular home design influencer shared it under the caption, "This homeowner turned HOA hate into an art movement." That post alone racked up hundreds of thousands of likes. Cynthia, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her house, once immaculate, now looked like a fortress of denial. Curtains perpetually drawn, front yard neglected. She still went for her morning walks, but now with her sunglasses on and posture tight, pretending not to notice the cars parked at the curb. The irony was brutal. The woman obsessed with curb appeal had become the one everyone whispered about. The final crack came when reporters returned for follow-up interviews. One crew even asked the HOA board for comment. Everyone declined except Cynthia. They caught her outside pruning her hedge, the camera light washing her pale face when she realized they weren't here to praise the HOA. They were here because of me. She stammered through stiff sentences about a lack of consideration for community uniformity, about visual pollution, about how attention-seeking behavior doesn't equal art. It was supposed to sound professional. Instead, it sounded like jealousy wrapped in word salad. The clip went viral for all the wrong reasons. Memes surfaced overnight. Someone paired her rant with clown music. Another video blinked between her and my bright mural with the caption, "Find the creativity." What happened next wasn't funny, it was Shakespearean. Outraged, she vented on the HOA's social feed. She demanded emergency action, accused me of defamation by aesthetics, and even hinted that she'd repaint her house to restore balance. No one supported her. Most of the comments were people telling her to calm down or move. For weeks, she tried retaliation through procedure. Formal complaints, color-matching petitions, attempts to reinstate the HOA's former bylaws. But now, the board members had seen the spotlight, and they wanted none of her bad PR. Eventually, they turned on her. Quietly, politely, but firmly. The HOA president released a public statement, recognizing my house as a creative interpretation of community pride. The irony. They framed my rebellion as a victory for individual expression within HOA guidelines. Translation, they were tired of looking foolish. The statement went viral again. This time, even national news sites chimed in. HOA celebrates colorful home after viral feud. Cynthia's fury curdled into humiliation. One evening, as sunset hit the neighborhood, I saw her standing by her driveway, staring at my house with an expression I couldn't read. Somewhere between defeat and disbelief, neighbors walked by, waving at me, taking pictures, asking when I planned my next art project. Kids played on bikes in front of the mural, shouting that it looked like a rainbow wave. Even the mail carrier lingered, snapping a photo. Cynthia just stood there, silently watching as the community she'd once controlled moved on without her. Days later, the final scene of her downfall arrived. Unplanned, unprovoked, completely poetic. A local podcast arranged a color harmony competition, inviting communities to showcase unique neighborhood designs inspired by household creativity. Cedarwood Heights was nominated because of my mural. The board agreed unanimously. Our entry photo would feature the most recognizable backdrop in town. The irony was complete. The HOA, in all its beige glory, would now be represented by the house they tried to erase. Cynthia didn't show up to the vote. When the results came in, Cedarwood Heights won third place. A small victory, but symbolic. The HOA used the recognition to advertise community inclusion and pride. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. But any sympathy evaporated the following week when I learned she'd filed one last desperate report to city zoning. It claimed my house violated property balance ordinances under aesthetic regulation. The city inspector arrived, clipboard ready, walking the property briskly before chuckling quietly. He shook his head and left without writing a single note. Her last weapon, bureaucracy, had failed her entirely. And just like that, she was done. Quietly, completely, and undeniably finished. A for sale sign appeared in her manicured yard 2 weeks later. The day I saw it, I felt a weird mix of satisfaction and melancholy. When she drove away that final morning, she didn't look back. Her SUV glided past my mural, its windows rolled up, expression unreadable behind the tint. As the dust settled, the neighborhood didn't quite cheer. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. She tried to turn my home into an eyesore. Instead, she made it a masterpiece. She tried to bury me under policy and power. Instead, she handed me a platform. And in trying to shame me, she made me unforgettable. After Cynthia moved out, Cedarwood Heights exhaled. Like a community holding its breath for too many years that finally remembered how to breathe. The silence she left behind didn't feel eerie. Felt peaceful. For months, her presence had been the shadow behind every friendly wave, the whisper behind every rule reminder. Without her, the neighborhood began to rediscover itself one color at a time. It started subtly. The family across the street, the Parkers, repainted their shutters forest green. The Langleys, 2 houses down, replaced their beige mailbox with one painted in rust red. And the retired couple at the cul-de-sac, the same ones who'd been threatened with fines for leaving a garden sculpture too long in view, painted their fence soft yellow. Little by little, the bland conformity that had muted our community began to crack. For the first time in years, Cedarwood Heights looked alive. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't flashy. It was human. Funny thing was, the HOA didn't fight it. The new board, humbled by the public attention, quietly scrapped half of its appearance compliance guidelines. A few bureaucratic holdouts grumbled, but even they knew resistance was useless. The neighborhood had tasted freedom, and there's no unlearning freedom once it starts blooming. Then came something I didn't expect. People started asking questions. Journalists, artists, city planners. They saw Cedarwood Heights not as a cautionary tale, but as a blueprint, an example of what happens when ordinary people refuse silent control. I was asked to speak on local panels about creative resistance. Though the term made me laugh every time, I didn't feel like a rebel. I felt like someone who accidentally made a point too loud to ignore. But the attention did something special to the neighborhood. It united everyone. For once, we weren't defined by complaints or color codes. We were known for collaboration. People who hadn't talked in years now worked together to redesign community spaces. The HOA budget, once wasted on nonsense like mailbox standardization, was used to fund benches, gardens, murals, and new signage at the gates. Someone even jokingly suggested calling us Colorwood Heights. The name stuck online for weeks, half teasing, half affectionate. The mural on my house slowly became the heart of it all. Not as a symbol of defiance, but as a story, a reminder. Kids drew crayon versions of it. The neighborhood newsletter featured it on the cover with the tagline, "Community by choice, not compliance." Even the city started noticing. A tourism guide included Cedarwood Heights in their section on hidden charms of suburbia. The first line read, "Sometimes the brightest stories begin with the smallest acts of rebellion." That hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't just painted over a complaint. I'd accidentally painted over fear. Still, not everything was perfect. A few older residents joked, or maybe half meant, that the neighborhood had gotten too colorful. But even that criticism faded when they realized nobody cared enough to enforce their disapproval. Freedom had made rule followers irrelevant. And strangely enough, I started missing Cynthia in one small way, not as a neighbor, but as the spark. Without her, none of it would have happened. It was the irony I loved most about life. People who crave control often set freedom in motion without realizing it. As weeks stretched into months, something remarkable happened. New families started moving in, drawn not by the uniform houses, but by the personality they radiated now. They saw a neighborhood not afraid of color, laughter, or standing out. One afternoon, I saw a moving truck pull into Cynthia's old driveway. Out stepped a young couple with 2 kids, paint samples in hand. Bold ones, rich, lively shades of teal and red. The same kinds of colors that once would have made her march straight to the HOA office. Watching them test pallets on the garage, I realized how complete the transformation had become. Her house, the very temple of uniformity, was about to wear color too. There was something poetic about that. That evening, as the sun set over Cedarwood Heights, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee. My mural caught the sunset perfectly. The rich blue dimming into purple, the gold accents glowing like embers. It had survived rain, wind, and scrutiny. It had survived hatred. Now it was just part of the scenery, not a rebellion anymore, just a fixture of life. And that's when it hit me, true change doesn't scream forever. It settles in quietly, becoming background noise until you can't imagine life before it. That's what we were now, a neighborhood that forgot how to fear standing out. And I could feel, in the stillness of that golden hour, that we hadn't just repainted a house. We'd repainted the rules. Change moves slowly until the day it doesn't. Months after our quiet neighborhood revolution, the mural that started it all began reaching farther than any of us imagined. Online, it was still trending occasionally, popping up in art forums and viral compilations titled things like, "How One Man Outsmarted His HOA." But one spring morning, it crossed a new threshold. A national architecture magazine featured it on the cover. Not as a quirky story or neighborhood drama, but as a statement, an essay titled "Color versus Conformity." When one home defines a movement, they didn't include my name, just a photo of the mural gleaming under the morning sun, framed by blooming trees and silhouetted kids on bicycles. And that anonymity made it more powerful. Soon, other people began sharing their own house projects, writing things like, "Inspired by the Blue House." Photos poured in from across the country. One wall painted with swirling patterns, another covered in wild colors. Different cities, different rules, same expression. People building defiance without anger, just creativity. It was surreal to realize my small act of rebellion had become a movement, even one no bigger than a hashtag. By summer, the traffic on our street picked up again. This time, friendly. Couples walked with cameras. Families stopped for pictures. Teachers brought art students to study community-led design. Even a local politician gave a speech about architectural individuality in front of my mural. That part made me laugh. A politician talking about rebellion as policy. But amid all the attention, what struck me most wasn't fame or flattery. It was what had happened to the people around me. The neighbors who once hid behind beige became builders of expression. The HOA that once sent warnings now hosted art walks. We weren't fighting anymore. We were creating. What used to be silent streets had become a living gallery. Kids chalked rainbows on driveways. Garden fences glowed with fairy lights. Even the mailbox at the cul-de-sac wore a cheerful sunflower design painted by a group of retirees who once complained about visual clutter. Cedarwood Heights had found its soul again, and somehow we'd done it together. But the moment that made me realize how far we'd come wasn't grand or televised. It was quiet. One morning, I stepped out to grab my mail and saw a postcard tucked between magazines. No return address, just one line written in elegant cursive. "It's beautiful. You were right." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name. I knew that handwriting. Letters from the HOA had once carried that same script. Cynthia. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it, feeling the kind of closure you never expect to get. She didn't apologize. She didn't have to. That line was enough. In one simple sentence, She'd painted over 1,000 little battles, one misunderstanding at a time. I placed the postcard on my kitchen shelf, right beneath a photo of the house. Bright, blue, unapologetic. Some weeks later, a documentary company reached out, wanting to feature the art of neighborly defiance. They framed me as a symbol of creativity overcoming authority. But when they interviewed me, I told them it wasn't rebellion at all. It was restoration. Because deep down, I hadn't painted my house just to prove Cynthia wrong. I'd done it because I refused to let someone else decide what joy looked like. And in doing that, I'd reminded a neighborhood what individuality really meant. The irony never left me. A battle fought over ugly color had turned into one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. In the months that followed, property values in Cedarwood Heights quietly rose. Not because of walls or paint, but because of pride. People wanted to live here again, among those who weren't afraid to be themselves. Sometimes, at twilight, I'd sit on the porch as sunset burned across the mural. The colors changed with the shifting light. Indigo melting into purple, purple into gold. And I realized something important. The mural wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been told to conform and had chosen not to. To the quiet rebels who found peace in standing out. It was a symbol of boundaryless creativity in a world obsessed with straight lines. And maybe, more than anything, it was proof that the greatest revenge against control isn't anger. It's beauty. Because people forget noise, but they don't forget color. And that's how my story, the story Cynthia started with a complaint, ended with a movement painted across the nation, one house at a time.